In the summer of 1967, a young Army volunteer named Hamilton Gregory walked into an induction center in Nashville, Tennessee. A sergeant pulled him aside, pointed to another young man sitting by himself, and said, "I want you to take charge of Gupton." Over the next few hours, Gregory discovered why. Johnny Gupton couldn't read. He couldn't write. He didn't know his home address, didn't know what state he was from, had never heard of a place called Vietnam, and didn't know what basic training was. He thought a nickel was worth more than a dime, because it was bigger. The United States Army took him anyway. Johnny Gupton was one of 354,000 men that the Department of Defense deliberately recruited, even though they had already been rejected as mentally or physically unfit for service. The government called them New Standards Men. The soldiers who served alongside them had a different name. They called them McNamara's Morons. And what happened to them is one of the most disturbing stories in American military history. To understand how 354,000 of America's most vulnerable citizens ended up in a war zone, you have to understand the man who put them there. Robert McNamara was a numbers man. Before he became Secretary of Defense, he was the president of Ford Motor Company. He believed that any problem, no matter how complex, could be solved with data, systems, and modern management techniques. President Kennedy brought him to the Pentagon in 1961, and McNamara ran the Department of Defense the way he ran Ford, with spreadsheets, computers, and absolute confidence that he was the smartest person in the room. But by 1966, McNamara had a problem that even his spreadsheets couldn't solve. The Vietnam War was escalating fast. Monthly draft calls had hit 49,300, the highest since the Korean War. The military was rejecting roughly 600,000 young men per year for failing basic qualification standards, and President Johnson was terrified of what would happen politically if he started drafting college students or calling up the National Guard and reserves. They needed bodies, but they couldn't take them from families who voted, from communities that had political power, from sons whose parents would call their congressman. So on August 23, 1966, McNamara stood before the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention at the New York Hilton and announced a new initiative. The Pentagon would begin accepting 100,000 men per year who had previously failed the Armed Forces Qualification Test. He called it Project 100,000 and framed it as part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. His exact words, "Poverty in America pockmarks its victims inwardly. Hundreds of thousands of men can be salvaged from the blight of poverty, and the Defense Department is particularly well equipped to salvage them." Salvaged. That was the word he used, like they were broken machinery on a factory floor. But here's what the public didn't know. The announcement caught the Pentagon by surprise. Military leaders had what the New York Times described as grave doubts and accepted the plan with bitter disappointment. General William Westmoreland, the commanding general in Vietnam, would later call Project 100,000 a disaster. The generals knew exactly what was about to happen. They just couldn't stop it. The men recruited under Project 100,000 scored in Category 4 on the Armed Forces Qualification Test. That's the 10th to 30th percentile, corresponding to IQ scores of roughly 72 to 91. Before this program, the military only accepted Categories 1 through 3, but it gets worse. Through a loophole called administrative acceptance, an additional 30,301 men who scored in Category 5 below the 10th percentile with IQs below 71 in the range of clinical cognitive disability were also inducted. The demographics tell a devastating story. Over 41% of New Standards men were African American, compared to just 12% of the armed forces overall. A Randy Corporation study found that 38% were Black or Hispanic, compared to only 10% of the standard military control group. War correspondent Joe Galloway, who earned a Bronze Star for valor at the Battle of Ia Drang, described them as mostly black and redneck whites, hailing from the mean big city ghettos and the remote Appalachian valleys. Most were high school dropouts reading at a 6th grade level. 13% read below a 4th grade level. Many were completely illiterate. Some had recruiters take the qualification test for them because they couldn't read the questions. A Cleveland-based Marine recruiter testified before Congress that forging test results was a common practice, and every single one of them had their enlistment contract stamped with a large red letter on the first page. They were branded from the very first day. McNamara had promised that advanced education and medical techniques, specifically videotapes and closed-circuit TV lessons, would transform these men into capable soldiers. The reality? Only 7.5% of New Standards men received any kind of remedial vocational training. No special training was provided to drill instructors for handling cognitively impaired recruits. Instead, the drill instructors just forged their scores and pushed them through. Hamilton Gregory documented what happened in training. Men who couldn't field strip weapons because their reflexes were too slow. Recruits who threw live grenades like baseballs straight at targets instead of in an arc. Men who sprinted the first 100 yards of a mile run and then collapsed. One recruit wore 2 right boots for days and couldn't tell the difference. Because these men couldn't qualify for technical assignments, they were funneled directly into infantry. Pentagon monitoring data shows that 37% of New Standards men were assigned to combat roles, compared to just 22% of the control group. That's 68% higher. And the racial disparity inside the program was even worse. 44.5% of Black New Standards men received combat assignments versus 38.8% of white recruits. Many were assigned to walk point, the most dangerous position on a patrol, the man who sweeps for mines and booby traps. Hamilton Gregory documented that over 1,500 Project 100,000 men were killed by mines and booby traps alone, many because they were, in his words, too slow to perceive they were triggering a booby trap. In total, 5,478 Project 100,000 men were killed in service. 20,270 were wounded. An estimated 500 came home as amputees. Among those deployed to combat zones, the death rate was roughly 3 times higher than other American soldiers in Vietnam. The statistics are staggering, but the individual stories are what make this unforgivable. Freddie Hensley was handsome enough that people assumed he was normal, but he was, medically speaking, severely cognitively impaired. His reflexes were too slow to qualify with the M14 rifle. He believed that thunder and lightning were completely unrelated events. An instructor forged his passing grade on the rifle qualification test. Hensley was sent to combat in Vietnam and killed in action. His mother later said, "He was a good boy. He was my little man. Why did they have to draft him?" Robert Romo was autistic and had failed the qualification test. His uncle, First Lieutenant Barry Romo, was already serving as a platoon leader in Vietnam when he found out Robert was in basic training at Fort Lewis. Barry wrote the base commander, warning that Robert would certainly die in combat. The request was denied. Robert was sent to a frontline infantry unit. He was shot in the neck on patrol, and according to multiple accounts, fellow soldiers refused to treat him. He died slowly, drowning in his own blood. Friendly fire incidents involving Project 100,000 men were tragically common. In one documented case, a New Standards Marine was given the ambush password but couldn't remember it. He left his position without telling anyone, wandered into the kill zone, and his own squad killed him when the squad leader sprang the ambush. An infantry squad leader captured the grim calculus perfectly. If anybody has to die, better a dummy than the rest of us. First Lieutenant Herb DuBose, a black officer who served in Vietnam, saw Project 100,000 up close. Years later, after watching McNamara cry about poor children during his resignation from the World Bank, DuBose said something that cuts right through every justification McNamara ever offered. "I saw McNamara when he resigned from the World Bank, crying about the poor children of the world. But if he did not cry at all for any of those men he took in under Project 100,000, then he really doesn't know what crying is all about. Many under me weren't even on a 5th grade level. No skills before, no skills after. The Army was supposed to teach them a trade in something. Only they didn't." Jan Scruggs, the veteran who founded the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, remembered the men of the special platoons in basic training. He said, "Each deserved a simple life, doing something besides soldiering or being in combat. Forrest Gump was real. There were thousands of them. He never mentioned Project 100,000. Not in this documentary. Not in his 1995 memoir In Retrospect. Not anywhere, ever." As journalist Myra McPherson wrote, "Do not look to Robert McNamara's memoir for any information on this project. In retrospect, his bloodless account of how he and his colleagues were wrong, terribly wrong about Vietnam, conveniently ignores this deplorable brainstorm of his. McNamara died on July 6, 2009, at the age of 93. He never publicly acknowledged or apologized for Project 100,000. But the cruelty of this program didn't end when the war did. Over 100,000 New Standards men received less than honorable discharges. The reason cited? Unsuitable for military service. The exact condition the military had knowingly recruited them despite having. Those discharges permanently barred them from every single VA benefit: healthcare, disability compensation, housing assistance, education under the GI Bill, and mental health treatment. Think about that. The government identified these men as unfit, recruited them anyway, sent them to the most dangerous assignments in Vietnam, and then kicked them out for being unfit, and slapped them with a discharge status that guaranteed they could never get help. A 1989 study sponsored by the Department of Defense itself, the first one they ever bothered to conduct, confirmed what everyone already knew. Non-veterans with similar backgrounds were better off in employment, education, and income. The income gap was $5,000 to $7,000 per year in favor of men who never served. The military didn't lift these men out of poverty. It pushed them deeper in. No class action lawsuit has ever been filed. No congressional investigation. No official government apology. To this day, surviving Project 100,000 veterans, now in their mid-70s to early 80s, have never received any formal recognition or remedy from the government that exploited them. The first real hope came just recently. In February 2025, Professor Eleanor Morales of Wake Forest University published a landmark article in the Duke Law Journal proposing presumptive discharge relief for surviving New Standards men, similar to what was granted to veterans discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. If implemented, it would restore veteran status and unlock access to VA, healthcare, housing, and disability benefits. But for many of these men, it's already too late. Project 100,000 wasn't classified. McNamara announced it on a stage, but the detailed outcome data, the racial demographics, the casualty statistics, the internal assessments, all of that was buried in restricted DoD reports and archive boxes for decades. Hamilton Gregory, the Army intelligence agent who met Johnny Gupton on his first day, spent 45 years tracking down every document, every veteran account, every piece of evidence. He wrote letters to every member of Congress from boot camp. Only one responded, Bobby Kennedy, and then Kennedy was assassinated in June of 1968. Gregory's book, published in 2015 after nearly half a century of research, was endorsed by four-star General Anthony Zinni, who wrote, "This book should be read by every one of our political leaders who need to understand the effects of stupid decisions made by those who do not understand the nature of war." Project 100,000 cites alongside the Tuskegee syphilis study, nuclear testing on soldiers, and Agent Orange exposure in the archive of government programs that exploited the most vulnerable Americans. But unlike Tuskegee, which received a presidential apology in 1997, Project 100,000 has received nothing. No acknowledgement, no apology, no reparations. War correspondent Joe Galloway, who saw the worst of Vietnam firsthand, wrote this after. McNamara died in 2009. The good book says we must forgive those who trespass against us. But what about those who trespass against the most helpless among us? Those willing to conscript the mentally handicapped, the most innocent, and turn them into cannon fodder. Johnny Gupton, the man Hamilton Gregory was told to take charge of on his very first day, survived Vietnam. A compassionate sergeant who had a mentally disabled sister sheltered him from the worst dangers. Gupton died at age 57. If you want to understand how the Vietnam War was really fought and who actually paid the price, there's a video on screen right now that goes deeper. And if this story made you feel something, subscribe. There are more stories like this one that the history books left out.